Bismillah walhamdulillah wa salatu wa salamu ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa ashabihi wa man tabi'ahum bi isanin ila yawmiddin wa ba'd. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Jumping back into the book Miftāḥ Ṭarīq or Miftāḥ Ṭarīq al-Muḥibbīn. This is Miftāḥ Ṭarīq al-Muḥibbīn by the great al-Wāsiṭī. We're now looking at another section. This is our sixth class so far. And we're going to begin here as the Imām rahimahullah ta'ala, he says, وَالْأَمْرُ الَّذِي يُبَلِّغُ السَّالِكَ بِهِ إِلَى الْمَطْلُوبِ بِمَعُونَةِ اللَّهِ هُوَ الْأَمْرُ الْوَسَطُ الْمُعْتَدِلُ من الصوم والفطر والجوع والشبع والتقشف والتنعم والتسبب والتجرد. So here he says the means by which the wayfarer reaches their goal with Allah's aid lies in a balanced and moderate approach between fasting and eating, hunger and satiety, austerity and comfort, earning a livelihood, and detachment from worldly means. Okay? We have couples of things he mentions here, opening this section with a clear maxim, a legal, a spiritual law or rule for this path, and it's balance and measured moderation. Balance, keeping the scales balanced between excess and negligence, and employing measured moderation, okay? Measured in terms of a legal sense, not in terms of a personal sense. Measured moderation. And this is a core teaching in the tradition, to be balanced, not to fall on either side of the spectrum, the extremes, where you either go beyond the limits or you fall short. And this is found in the Quran. The concept, as Allah says, وَكَذَلِكَ جَعَلْنَاكُمْ أُمَّةً وَسَطًا. And so we have made you a balanced community. This is Surah Al-Baqarah, chapter 2, verse number 143. If you look at the great scholars of tafsir like Imām al-Tabari, he expounds upon this a bit, and he mentions that Allah described here the ummah as wasat. You could say a balanced or middle nation, or you could say the best nation, because sometimes the word wasat is used to mean khiyar, the best of nations. And the reason that it's described as the best nation is because it is a balanced nation. It has moderation in religion. He says they are neither people of excess like the Christians who went to extremes in monasticism, like with the monks, and their claims about Isa. Okay, they have multiple different claims within their various different expressions of their Christianity. Nor are they the people of neglect, like the Jews who altered the book of Allah, killed the prophets, lied about their Lord, and disbelieved in Him. Rather, they are a people of balance and moderation in their religion. Allah praised them with this quality because the most beloved matters to Allah are those that are moderate. Okay, so that's Imām al-Tabari. So while his concept or his addressing this wasatiyya of our ummah, this balanced nature of the Prophet's followers, he's talking about or addressing some issues in doctrine, okay? But we can also find in the Hadith literature that there's guidance pertaining to a balance in worship as well, and is what we do. The Prophet ﷺ encouraging balance and often erring on the side of taking the easier route over the more difficult route. There's a hadith I've mentioned previously, and it's worth mentioning again in this setting. He says, إِنَّ الدِّينَ يُسْرٌ وَلَنْ يُشَادَّ الدِّينَ أَحَدٌ إِلَّا غَلَبَهُ فَسَدِّدُوا وَقَارِبُوا وَأَبْشِرُوا. This is in Sahih al-Bukhari. He says, indeed, this religion is ease, and no one makes it hard upon himself except that it will overwhelm him. Okay, and you can find that being the case as well as a tried and true practice where people get overly excited, overly zealous, and they burden themselves with many things, even by altering the religion, approaching it with a lack of understanding as to what is required of you. And this burdens them, and they become overwhelmed, and they can burn out. He says, فَسَدِّدُوا وَقَارِبُوا وَأَبْشِرُوا. So it basically means take aim. Saddidu means basically take aim, like you would drawing the arrow back on the bow. You take aim at your target, And when you release, the concept is that you get close. وَقَارِبُوا. You might not hit the bullseye, but you're going to get close. وَأَبْشِرُوا. Right? And then receive glad tidings. Receive the glad tidings, basically, of the fulfillment of what was required of you. فَاتَّقُوا اللَّهَ مَا اسْتَطَعْتُمْ. Right? To fear Allah to the ability that you have, to your ability. All right? So having this balance here is extremely important in order to maintain your course throughout the duration of your existence on this earth. Imam al-Wāsiṭī goes on and he mentions some examples, as we saw, fasting and breaking your fast or eating, and that's what he talks about in this next part. He says, أَمَّا الصَّوْمُ فَيَكْفِيهِ صَوْمُ الْأَيَّامِ الْفَاضِلَةِ الْمَشْرُوعَةِ. He says, as for fasting, it's sufficient to observe the virtuous prescribed days of fasting, كَالِاثْنَيْنِ وَالْخَمِيسِ وَأَيَّامِ الْبِيضِ وَيَوْمِ عَرَفَةِ وَيَوْمِ عَاشُورَاءِ. He says here that these are the days like fasting on Mondays and Thursdays, the white days, which are known as the 13th, 14th, and 15th of each lunar month, the day of Arafah, and the day of Ashura. So rather than fasting constantly, every day, outside of Ramadan, of course, which is an obligation, where you're pushing your body perhaps to exhaustion, the Imam advises fasting on virtuous days that have been legislated by the Prophet ﷺ. And he lists these days. They're regular days, okay? Or there are days that occur once in the year, then there are days that occur during the week, and some occur once in every month. So you have a weekly, a monthly, and an annually prescribed schedule of fasting. He fasted on these days, alayhi salatu wassalam. He personally fasted them regularly and encouraged everyone else to fast them as well, as opposed to every single day. And this was actually something he encountered. A man came to him and said, I'm going to fast every day. And the Prophet ﷺ corrected him by saying, خَيْرُ الصِّيَامِ صِيَامُ دَاوُودَ. Like the best fast is that of Dawood ﷺ. It's the Prophet David. كَانَ يَصُومُ يَوْمًا وَيُفْطِرُ يَوْمًا. He would fast one day, and he would break his fast the next day. And you can find this in Sahih Bukhari. And you would note some very spiritual, powerful dimensions working here in this Siyam Dawood, actually. And if we have time, we'll rehash those later on. But that's why the Prophet ﷺ knows khayru siyam, the best fast, is probably the most powerful type of fast in terms of the results that you'll get out of it. And we're not talking about dropping weight. We're talking about growing stronger spiritually with this. But the concept is there, that it's not a continuous every day. Although we could discuss wisal, which is known as the continuous fast, at another time. That does exist. However, to maintain balance for most people, Imam al-Wāsiṭī is recommending a regular fast, which is based on these ayyam al-fadila, the virtuous days that have been prescribed. And then he says, of course, وَبَعْضُ هَذَا يَكْفِيهِ إِنْ عَجَزَ عَنْ جَمِيعِهِ. Okay, giving you a door out in the event that even that might be a burden to you. If he's unable to fast all of these, meaning those virtuous days, then even fasting some of them is sufficient. So long as you're engaging in fasting at some point outside of your obligatory fast. All right? And we've talked about this in the past, that some people, there are some people, we're going to get to this shortly, their mizaj, which is like their temperament or their state, it doesn't match well with fasting. They find it to be very arduous. They get very tired. Their brain gets foggy. They cannot concentrate in their obligatory acts of worship like prayer. And they're hindered from other acts of prayer or other acts of worship like reading the Quran, pondering, reflecting, especially if they're students of knowledge, seeking knowledge. This might become very difficult, and so on and so forth, right? If you're not going to do any of that anyway, well then fast. Right? So you got to kind of be honest with yourself. I mean, the thing is you can't do nothing. Okay? You can't go, well, fasting doesn't really work for me because I get tired, but I don't really do anything otherwise anyway. Which means you might as well fast. Okay? So you got to kind of be in tune with yourself and always be mindful of what your goals are spiritually, and know that this is a very powerful tool at your disposal if it works for you. So the lesson that Imam al-Wāsiṭī is obviously offering us is that fasting, it should support your path and not strain your health or distract you from remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It should be a support to you. And though the Imam here in this opening line is of course, he hasn't elaborated yet, we're going to get to it shortly, he's pairing Sawm, fasting, and fitr, eating. He's pairing ju', hunger, and shib'a, which is being full. Okay? He hints at a deeper truth that we're going to talk about, and that is what and how much we consume affects our spiritual receptivity, what we're able to receive. So a spiritually inclined seeker aims for a light, alert, balanced state, neither exhausted from deprivation nor dulled by indulgence. Okay? Getting that moderation. And the balance here is central to our tradition in Islam. And you can find it in humoral theory, or humoral theory. This is that, what I was talking about, it's kind of like the traditional medicine of really earlier generations before the advent of the more modern science and biology, etc. And this is where health depended on the balance of what they considered four qualities, which were heat, cold, moisture, and dryness. And they noted that overeating disrupts this balance. Not just physically disrupts the balance, but also has a spiritual impact as well. So he expounds upon this and he says, وَالْجُوعُ وَالشِّبَعُ فَلْيَعْتَمِدْ عَلَى أَكْلِ الْأَشْيَاءِ الرَّطْبَةِ الْمُوَلِّدَةِ لِلْأَخْلَاطِ الصَّحِيحَةِ. Okay, as for hunger and satiety, one should rely on consuming moist foods that produce healthy humors. This is al-akhlāt as-sahīḥah. Humors is not like humor as we would think of today, like funny, they got a sense of humor, but it's these states. And it comes from the word fluid. So it's basically talking about the four fluids of the body, okay, which we'll look at in a little bit more detail shortly. So he says that you want to have these foods, consuming moist foods that produce healthy humors, والدم الصحي, and healthy blood, كالمسلوقة واللبن أو الحليب والعسل المرقق بالماء ويغلى حتى يبقى كالدبس السائل ومثل الفواكه الناضجة كالمشمش والبطيخ والعنب وأمثالها. And he says, so you could have foods like boiled foods, milk or fresh dairy, honey diluted with water and boil until it becomes like liquid molasses, and ripe fruits like apricots, melons, and grapes. Okay, giving you some examples there. وَيَجْتَنِبُوا الْأَغْذِيَةَ الْمُوَلِّدَةَ لِلسَّوْدَاءِ إِلَّا الْقَلِيلَ مِنْهَا فَإِنَّ الْبَدَنَ لَا يَسْتَغْنِي عَنْ ذَوَاتِ الطُّعُومِ كَالْحَامِضِ وَالْحِرِّيفِ وَالْمَالِحِ. He said they should avoid foods that produce excessive black bile, except in small amounts, for the body requires a balance of varied flavors such as sour, spicy, and salty. So here, the section that we're looking at, Imam al-Wāsiṭī emphasizes spiritual progress having a direct connection to bodily health. Okay? Taking care of our bodies is important as a means to taking care of our nafs, our inward spiritual self. So just as the seeker is trying to strike a balance in their worship, they also have to strike a balance in their diet, looking at not only how much they eat, but what it is that they're eating. Wāsiṭī advises consuming these foods that are moist foods, boiled things, easily digestible foods, milk, diluted honey, ripe fruits, apricots, melons. He gives you a basic diet here, and he encourages the reader to generate healthy blood and healthy humors, maintaining clarity of mind as well as of body. And then warns against excessive consumption of foods that produce soda. And this is referred to as the black bile. Because there's black bile, there's like yellow bile that they refer to in this framework here. And he warns that excessive consumption of these types of foods that produce this are associated with melancholy and sluggishness, but does leave room for small amounts of stronger flavors. It's like sour and salty and spicy. Like allows room for small amounts of this, recognizing that the body has a natural need for variety. Okay, and you can find that referenced in the Quran where the people wanted a variety of food. They don't just want to be stuck on one thing all the time, but they want a variety. It's a natural inclination of us to want to have variety in our diet. However, that can be abused. Okay, so what he's talking about humorism here, this reflects a classical understanding of medical theory that was shared across both Greco-Arab traditions. And this was a system that the Islamic world inherited from Greek physicians like Hippocrates. And then, of course, it was further developed by the great Muslim thinkers of that time, like Ibn Sina. And he has a book called Al-Qanun fi al-Tib, Al-Razi, and Ibn al-Nafis. Others, they also worked in this field. And the framework, as I said, is based on these humors or fluids. There's blood, there's phlegm, there's yellow bile, and there's black bile. And they say that all these things have to remain in balance for health and clarity. So as I said, excess bile, black bile, was thought to darken the soul and obscure perception. And as a side note, I thought this was interesting, applying this framework to the supplication that's made after breaking the fast. If you think about what we say, ذهب الظمأ وابتلت الأروق وثبت الأجر إن شاء الله. Because we're talking about states of moistness and dryness and roughness, etc. When you break the fast, you say this supplication that says the thirst has gone, the veins are moistened, and the reward is certain if Allah wills. So the classic humoral theory, the human body was believed to be governed by these four primary fluids, or akhlat. As he says, al-akhlat is-sahiha. Okay, these akhlat, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile. So blood is associated with warm and moist. Phlegm is associated with cold and moist. Yellow bile, warm and dry. Black bile, cold and dry. And so in terms of having good health or having a balance in your health, al-iʿtidāl here, the balance, it was defined by balance in these four humors. Imbalance, which was known as su'l mizaj. Okay, su'l mizaj, that's an imbalance in like your physicality or physiological imbalance. This could result in illness, lethargy, or spiritual dullness. All right, so when we look at that dua that we say, ذهب الظمأ وابتلت العروق وثبت الأجر إن شاء الله, if we look at it again, understanding kind of the framework there that they were using, you'll see that when you say the thirst is gone, it addresses dehydration, which in humorism was considered to increase dryness, often worsening bile-related imbalances. Or when he says the veins are moistened, it's a literal humoral restoration, moistening the veins, rehydrating the body's internal systems, aiding circulation and restoring equilibrium to the humors. And the reward is established if Allah wills. This affirms that the fast was not only physically beneficial, but also spiritually as well, because you're being rewarded, emphasizing that proper fasting is not harmful, physically of course, but actually restorative for both the body and the spirit when done correctly. Okay, so Imam al-Wāsiṭī advises that light food, moist foods, things that avoid this black bile-inducing type of diet, he's advising this and he's thinking within this very framework of the humors. Foods that increase dryness or disrupt the humoral balance, they were seen to obstruct both the bodily health and the spiritual perceptivity. So the dua here of the Prophet ﷺ is not only a beautiful spiritual moment that a person has associated with eating food, associated with this experience of consuming, it actually marks the restoration of this balance after a period of intentional deprivation, of fasting. And it highlights that the prophetic path, ﷺ, was never meant to damage the body, but to purify it and to be in harmony with its natural constitution, if you will. And so the framework here, obviously not as popular today with the advancements in biomedical sciences, and now considered complementary or even alternative medicine or medical framework. And it doesn't replace modern science today, of course, but it's still deeply influential in many circles, including the development of al-Tibb al-Nabawi, which is the prophetic medicine. And so, having said all that, just to give you some understanding of where Imam al-Wāsiṭī is coming from and deriving his conclusions from, the point is clear, and that is that diet affects spiritual development. Regardless of what framework you're using, it's very clear in the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ that you have to sustain yourself on a halal, tayyib diet. At the very least, if you're not going to look into the details, to have a heavily imbalanced diet, eating heavy, according to Imam al-Wāsiṭī, it veils the heart, darkens the spirit. Okay, he goes on in the next part, he says, فَيَتَنَاوَلُ مِنَ الْأَغْذِيَةِ الْمُلَائِمَةِ قَدْرًا مُعْتَدِلًا بَيْنَ الْقَلِيلِ وَالْكَثِيرِ مثل أن يأكل حتى يكتفي ولا يمتلئ منه. Okay, so they should consume a moderate portion of suitable foods, neither excessive nor insufficient, eating just enough to satisfy their needs without overindulgence. وإذا شبع في يومه مرة فلا يشبع مرة أخرى فيه إلا إذا أصبح صائما ولكن يأكل لقيمات خفيفة على القلب حتى يبقى فارغا من ثقل الطعام. He says if they fill their stomach once in a day, they should not do so again unless they are fasting the next morning. Instead, they should eat only a few morsels that do not burden the heart, ensuring that the body remains free from the heaviness of food. Maintaining this type of diet. It's not just medically sound, but there's divine instruction behind it. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions in the Quran in Surah Al-A'raf, this is chapter 7, verse number 31, he says, كُلُوا وَاشْرَبُوا وَلَا تُسْرِفُوا إِنَّهُ لَا يُحِبُّ الْمُسْرِفِينَ. Eat and drink and do not be excessive. Indeed, he does not love those who are excessive. So Imam al-Wāsiṭī, when he's outlining these practical steps for moderation, meaning eat to satisfaction and not to fullness, these are steps that are divinely inspired, or directions from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He says, if one eats a full meal once, avoid doing so again the same day unless you're fasting. He encourages us to eat light, healthy foods that don't burden the heart. And these guidelines are based on the Prophet's instructions. The Prophet ﷺ, he says, مَا مَلَأَ آدَمِيٌّ وِعَاءً شَرًّا مِّن بَطْنٍ. He says that the son of Adam does not fill a vessel worse than his stomach. حَسَبَ ابْنِ آدَمَ أُكُلَاتٍ يُقِمْنَ صُلْبَهُ. A few bites are sufficient to sustain him. فَإِنْ كَانَ لَا مَحَالَةً فَثُلُثٌ لِطَعَامِهِ وَثُلُثٌ لِشَرَابِهِ وَثُلُثٌ لِنَفَسِهِ. He says, but if he must, meaning if he must fill, if he must eat till he's full, then a third for food, a third for his drink, and a third for him to breathe. Okay? This last part of the hadith, broken down into thirds, we need to understand, this is not the norm. That's what the Prophet ﷺ is getting at. This isn't the norm. Okay, every day I should think that the good diet is I'm going to feed myself until 1/3, 1/3, and 1/3. No, he's saying if you have to do that, then that's your limitation. Otherwise, ukulatin or luqaymat, he says, small bites, little portions, morsels of food that will keep you going. Right? You don't have to sit down, and you don't have to gorge yourself or overdo it every single time. And so the hadith here, it defines beautifully the spiritual and physical balance in eating. Okay? He also says, لا تكثروا الطعام فإن إكثار الطعام يقسي القلب. He says, do not overeat, for overeating hardens the heart. You find this in Shu'ab al-Iman by al-Bayhaqi. And this is what the companions attribute to the Prophet ﷺ. Too much food hardens the heart. A hard heart is closed to spiritual insight. Okay? Overconsumption is one of the causes for the heart to be veiled. It's also reported that he says, "Inna akthara an-nasi shib'an fi ad-dunya atwaluhum ju'an yawm al-qiyamah." He says that indeed those people who are most full in this world will be the hungriest on the day of judgment. This is found in Sunnah Tirmidhi. The point here is talking about overindulgence in the dunya, that it could come at a heavy cost in the hereafter. The Prophet ﷺ also encouraged overeating and being overweight. It's reported, رَأَى النَّبِيُّ صَلَى اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِ وسلم رَجَلًا عَظِيمَ الْبَطَنِ. He saw a man who had a large belly. فَقَالَ لَوْ كَانَ هَذَا فِي غَيْرِ هَذَا لَكَانَ خَيْرًا لَهُ. He said, if only this were in something other than this, it would have been better for him. Meaning, if only this weight that he's carrying around were in something other than this, besides his stomach, then it would be better for him. This is reported by Imam Ahmad in his book called Az-Zuhd. And this is like a very soft, gentle rebuke of sorts of the Prophet ﷺ, suggesting that the energy and the mass that the person has accumulated in their body it would be more suitable if it was in the service of his religion, the strength that is needed for worship, and not stored as excess weight that you carry around. The Prophet ﷺ also warned against being known for food. Right? It's just like the foodies that are out there, you know. He says, "Inna min asharri ummati man ukila lahu lahmu wa ghudhiya alayhi hatta asmana wa thaqul." He says, among the worst of my ummah are those who are fed the best meats, fattened by them, then become heavy. And they say, فَنَظَرَ فِي أَمْرِ اللَّهِ فَقَالَ مَا عَلَيَّ فِي مَا قَالَ اللَّهِ إِنَّمَا هُوَ فِي عِلْمِ اللَّهِ. They say something like, when it comes to Allah's commands, they say, what do I have to do with what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying? It's all in His knowledge. Again, Shu'ab al-Iman. This is by Imam al-Bayhaqi. So here, this hadith linking this overeating and indulgence with arrogance, negligence, and spiritual apathy. Companions also had similar views, of course shaped by the Prophet ﷺ, when it came to overeating. Perhaps a little bit stronger, as we might understand from Umar ibn al-Khattab, who was very strong individual. He had a strong position against being overweight and obesity. He says, إِيَّاكُمْ وَالْبِطْنَةِ فَإِنَّهَا مُفْسِدَةٌ لِلْجِسْمِ وَمُوَرِّثَةٌ لِلسَّقَمِ وَمُثَبِّطَةٌ عَنِ الصَّلَاةِ وَعَلَيْكُمْ بِالْقَسْطِ فِي طَعَامِكُمْ وَشَرَابِكُمْ فَإِنَّهُ أَبْعَدُ عَنِ الصَّرْفِ وَأَصَحُّ لِلْبَدَنِ وَأَقْوَى عَلَى الْعِبَادَةِ. He says, beware of overeating, for it corrupts the body, causes illness, and leads to laziness in prayer. Take a moderate path in your food and drink, for it is further from extravagance, healthier for the body, and stronger in supporting worship. This is reported by Ibn Abi Shaybah in his Musannaf. There's another narration. As Omar viewed gluttony as well as a spiritual and physical disease. It was almost repulsed by it. He considered to have strong ties to laziness and worship. It was narrated that Umar ibn Khattab once saw a man while he had a protruding belly, and he said, "Ma hadha? What's this?" The man said, he says, "Barakatun min Allah." It's a blessing from Allah. Umar said, "Bal adhab." He said, rather, this is a punishment. This is from Ibn Abi Shaybah. That might be an answer you'd get today. It's barakah. Yeah. If you're thin in our community, they'll actually reproach you for that. Oh, you need to eat some more. You know, you need to put on some weight, you know. You need to marry you to one nice cook, you know. She'll fatten you up. So you see here, in all seriousness, you can see from the Prophet, ﷺ, his companions, the righteous, they viewed overeating, carrying around extra weight. It's like a visible sign of negligence and excess. Okay? And you can find I could talk about this. We could talk about this subject for a long time. There's a lot reported on this. We cannot think that this is not a part of our religion. This is a big part of us as Muslims when it comes to our relationship with food. And it's unfortunate that, especially in Ramadan, we can see the cracks in our community when it comes to that, because we get very gluttonous and overindulgent with food. And you can see throughout history the great scholars of Islam, the great luminaries and spiritual masters, how they perceived it. Listen to this from Imam al-Shafi'i rahimahullah ta'ala. He says, ما شبعت منذ 16 سنة لأن الشبع يثقل البدن ويقسي القلب ويذهب الفطنة ويجلب النعاس ويضعف صاحبه عن العبادة. He says, I've not eaten to fullness in 16 years. Imam al-Shafi'i. I've not eaten to fullness. He ate, but he maintained a moderate diet. To fullness in 16 years. Forget 16 hours. Because he said, satiety, meaning to be full, burdens the body, hardens the heart, dulls the mind, induces sleep, and weakens a person from worship. Hilyatul Awliya, that's the book you find this in. All right? And there, as I said, there are numerous other examples. There are countless, almost, these types of examples. So Imam al-Wāsiṭī, from these examples, we can see why he goes on and he says, وَلَا يَدْخُلُ الطَّعَامُ عَلَى أَحَدٍ إِلَّا يَمْنَعُهُ مِنَ الصَّفَاءِ وَالنُّورِ. For there's nothing that weighs a person down, veiling them from clarity and light, like overindulgence in food. فَهَذَا حَدُّ الْأَكْلِ وَالْمَأْكُولِ وَقَانُونُهُ وَاللَّهُ الْمُوَفِّقُ وَالْمُعِينُ. These are the rules and guidelines of diet and food, and Allah is the one who grants success and assistance. That just gives you a little bit of some concepts when it comes to the connection between food, consumption, moderation, and spiritual development. The next kind of section here of this moderate approach, he says, وَأَمَّا التَّقَشُّفُ وَالتَّنَعُمُ فَلْيَسْتَعْمِلْ مِنَ التَّنَعُمِ مِثْلَ الْحَمَّامِ وَالنِّكَاحِ وَاللِّبَاسِ وَالطِّيبِ وَغَيْرِهِ بِقَدْرِ الْحَاجَةِ وَبِقَدْرِ مَا يَصْلُحُ بِهِ الْبَدَنِ. He says, as for abstinence, here we're not talking about abstinence from like sensual pleasures, but abstinence from the world or from the worldly delights, from comfort. So he says, as for abstinence, or asceticism, if you will, minimalism of sorts, and comfort, tana'um, one should partake in worldly comforts such as bathing, intimacy, clothing, fragrance, and the like, based on need, in a way that preserves the body's well-being. So the passage here is clear. Imam al-Wāsiṭī is following along the same theme, which is moderation, or iʿtidāl. And this is the key to progress on the spiritual journey. And now he addresses the seeker's use of worldly comforts, tana'um, versus taqashuf, which is asceticism, or to refrain or to be abstinent of them. And he reminds us that even the spiritual wayfarer has physical needs. Right? So you don't fall into excess when you go in the opposite direction. I'm not going to. I'm going to abandon everything. There are needs of even the most spiritual seekers, and fulfilling them in a moderate manner will support rather than hinder them on the path. Okay? And that goes for one that is overindulgent in them. That if they overindulge, it will hinder them along their path. Okay, so he mentions a couple of examples. Hammam, which is bathing. Washing, this is prophetic. A prophetic practice tied to not only hygiene, but ritual purification, and even emotional stability and clarity. When you become angry, one of the prescriptions is to go make what? Wudu. Okay? Nikah, or marriage, endorsed in the Sunnah, of course. It's a means to stabilizing one's desire, protecting one's chastity, and anchoring one's spirit. If you think about the nature of Adam alayhi salam, when he was alone, how did he begin to feel? Right? Became unstable, if you will, emotionally, until he was blessed with his mate in order to find sakina, tranquility. Okay? Then you have libas. He mentions clothing, and طيب, fragrances. This is part of the Prophet's life, his own routine. Because those things, they uplift and they dignify you. Good clothing, zina. Right? When you come into the masjid, you wear good clothes. And the Prophet ﷺ talked about طيب, fragrances being one of the delights of the world. Right? These things have a positive impact on your state of being. And if they are utilized in moderation, they can be supportive on your journey to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But the key is not to indulge, but stability based on, he says, qadrul haja, based on the need. You use it just enough to maintain health and function, not being excessive or overly luxurious. So he goes on and he says, فَمَتَى وَجَدَ الْبَدَنَ قَدْ تَقَشَّفَ وَقَحَلَ أَوْ قَارَبَ أَنْ يَتَقَشَّفَ رَطَّبَهُ وَغَذَّاهُ وَمَتَى وَجَدَهُ قَدْ كَانَ أَنْ يَقْسُ أَوْ يَغْلُظَ عَدَّلَهُ بِالتَّقَلُّلِ مِنَ الشَّهَوَاتِ وَالسَّوْمِ. He says, when one finds the body becoming excessively chapped and dry, remember the akhlat, the humors, we talked about being dry or being moist, okay? When you become excessively chapped and dry or about to be rough, he should moisten and nourish it, the body. But when he senses it is inclined toward hardness and harshness, he should temper it by curbing desires and engaging in fasting. And this is where the humoral theory that I mentioned to you before is clearly at play in this passage. Imam al-Wāsiṭī is definitely, or at least it seems to be obvious that he's tapping into that. Like Imam al-Wāsiṭī isn't prescribing external treatments alone, but he's talking about what's happening to your temperament, your mizaj. And it requires regular recalibration. You have to constantly be aware of your state and knowing how to manage it. So dryness, chapping, harshness, these may signify an imbalance of cold or dry humors, like the soda, having the black bile, or the belgham, which is like the phlegm associated with these states. So moisture and nourishment help restore the balance. Like if you were to have, using oils or certain appropriate foods, warm baths, etc. Those things, again, washing and stuff with warm water, this can help to stabilize the state. Whereas on the other side, when the desires, they increase, the body grows complacent or heavy, he then prescribes fasting and detachment from pleasures, minimal indulgences, where you're constantly playing this, I don't want to say game, but you know, it's like you're constantly bringing line in and letting line out, right? When you can, you get the line tight, and if it's going to snap, you got to let some line out. You got to keep tension on the line is what I'm getting at. You got to keep that thing tight. Letting it go, and you'll never get it back. It'll come right off the hook. Pull it too tight, it'll snap and it'll go as well. So you're lost either way unless you keep this balance, okay? If you ever grew up fishing, like I did, then you know there's an art to that, and it's about feel, right? It's not a rule 10 seconds this way, 10 seconds that way. You got to feel it out. The fight of the fish, you got to feel like, all right, you know the line, right? So when you're fishing, you know that the line that you're using, there's a strength to the line. It has a rating, how much weight it can hold. And you're going to use certain lines. So you got to know that, like you would know yourself. You have a weight limit that you can bear, and then you'll break. And if you don't know that, then that's why we're talking about the murid before. And the murshid, they need to have somebody that can help them understand their strengths and their limitations, okay? So when you're doing this, you know, like, okay, this line can hold a certain amount, and it feels based on the pull of this fish, the fight that's in it, I'm going to have to deal with it, and I just can't crank it in straight in. If it's something very light, I could just bring it in. It's not going to snap my line. Easy. Throw it in the boat. We're gone. We're good and gone. Bigger things to tackle, we might be there for a while. We might be working that thing for an hour or more. Line goes out. You start bringing it back in. Looks like it's going to snap. Let it go. There's this balance that constantly has to be maintained. That was a little North Carolina tidbit for you right there, growing up at the shores of North Carolina fishing with my dad. Yeah, it teaches, there's some lessons there, right? Yeah, there's a little tidbit there from the, down home. Okay? So anyway, you see the concept here is the balance that you have to strike constantly, okay? And you have to be aware of yourself. And then he goes on and he says, وَيَحُومُ حَوْلَ الْإِعْتِدَالِ فِي كُلِّ شَيْءٍ. Always keeping within the orbit of balance in all things. And this is gold. This line right here, وَيَحُومُ حَوْلَ الْإِعْتِدَالِ فِي كُلِّ شَيْءٍ, keeping within the orbit of balance in all things, it's golden here, right? Orbiting around in balance. It gives us a beautiful image. Imam al-Wāsiṭī creates an image for us. Like the seeker should constantly adjust themselves if you imagine the planet going around the sun. Okay? Notice it. Here's like the earth, for example. It goes around. There are seasons. There's summer, there's spring, there's fall, there's winter. There's different times. There's dryness, there's moistness, there's heat, there's cold, etc. And the earth is continuing like this in this orbit. It's never erratic, but it is constantly moving. Okay? It's constantly moving throughout these seasonal changes. And that's how the believer has to be. Now they're getting too close to the sun to be scorched, or too far away from it to freeze out. But in that balance where you're going to be constantly moving within these seasons of hotness and coldness, dryness and moistness. Okay, فَبِذَلِكَ يَكْمُلُ الْأَمْرُ بِمَعُونَةِ اللَّهِ تَعَالَى فَإِذَا أَعْطَى الْجَوَارِحَ حَقَّهَا فَيَشْرَعُ فَيَسْتَوْفِي الْحَقَّ الَّذِي عَلَيْهَا. He says, by doing so, the path to completion unfolds with Allah's aid. When he fulfills the rightful needs of his limbs, he can then devote himself to fulfilling the duties placed upon them. Okay, and this echoes a very profound truth, that neglecting the body in the name of spirituality often hinders worship. And we're feeling that. Some of us are feeling how that works. We are imposing a regimen upon ourselves, some of us a little stricter than others, when it comes to our diet and our sleep right now. We're talking in the last 10 days of Ramadan, where our calorie count is reduced for some it's increased. وَبِاللَّهِ الْمُسْتَعَانِ. Right? They're eating, not only matching their daily caloric intake before Ramadan, but sometimes surpassing that, ready to pack on some pounds in the month of fasting. عَذَابٌ مِّنَ اللَّهِ. I mean, that's how I'm a little sensitive to this topic. I'm passionate about this, so you have to excuse me if it seems like a little bit excessive. I don't want to be excessive here. I get passionate about the topic. But then we also have the sleep deprivation, okay? And now you're starting to see like, man, maybe I'm just not performing like I used to. I'm just tired. My energy's low, feeling dull, okay? Feeling a little dull. But we're requiring this so we can move in and out of those seasons, all right? Where we once were very moist, if you will, now we need to cool off and we need to dry out. Where we were a little bit too inclined towards giving into our indulgences, being excessive. Now this is the time where we get to dry out on all that and rein it all back in. We can wind it right back up, okay? So here, this is that concept being delivered there with our current situation and our current context of Ramadan in the last 10 days. Okay, and we have to understand that this neglecting the body on a regular basis in terms of trying to be developing your spirituality, it can actually put a hindrance, a roadblock in front of you. So basically, like if you're not healthy, if you're not rested, if you're not energized, then how are you going to stand for hours in the nighttime in tahajjud? You're already sleep deprived. How are you going to do it if you're not catching up with your rest in the daytime? If you're not setting some time aside in order to catch up on your recovery or focus, for example, in reciting the Quran or in dhikr. If you're overburdened by indulgence, you become tired, and you know how it is when you eat a big meal, you just kind of want to lay down and go to sleep. Or you're not eating enough and you're fatigued. Then how are you going to focus if your mind is cloudy and lost? Right? So this final line here reminds us that we have to take care of our bodies and taking care of our bodies is not vanity, so long as it's not done in an indulgent manner. It's not vanity, but it's a means to fulfill our spiritual purpose. The Prophet ﷺ, he says, "Inna li badinaka alayka haqqa," that your body has a right over you. You find this in Sahih Bukhari. All right, so again, just as a general concept here, we're now starting to look at a key to succeeding in this journey or this path, and that is to strike a balance in all things. And of course, the best of affairs are those which are moderate, measured, and balanced. And that's where we're going to wrap up for today. We'll pick up here tomorrow.